Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Lexi Eve here, and I'm out at McCarran Park in Brooklyn, just having a nice morning stroll. I was just right about over here somewhere, off in the distance. Did my morning practices, LBRP, Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Hexagram, and Liber OZ. Sat down at the baseball courts, some benches right behind me. Did my journaling, and this is just an intro to an interview I did about 2 nights ago. So I sat down on Zoom with Frater Orpheus, and we recorded an interview I did with him on his book on the rights of man. So I sat down, I read the book. My lord, it was fantastic. There are still paperbacks available, so if you're interested in what you hear in this podcast, if you're interested in Thelema, if you're interested in Liber OZ as a Thelemite, I would hope that you are. You need to get your hands on that book while supplies last. Hopefully there will be in the future a second edition that gets published, but until then, there are limited copies still available. I really highly recommend getting your hands on one. I have a copy of the regular hardcover. My fiance was gifted by Frater Orpheus a copy of the leather bound. Man, they are beautiful. If you did not get one, you do not know what you are missing. Get the paperback while supplies last. So Frater Orpheus is a longtime member of the AA. He's from California. He's a longtime member of O.T.O. And yeah, what could I say about Frater Orpheus? I know him for a few years. We've met in person when I ventured into California, and besides for his, he has wisdom, but it's not just that. He's just an all-around good dude. I have never once had a conversation with him that was anything but positive. Like, he just spews happiness, optimism, positivity, and it's like having a conversation with him, I can't be upset, So man, this was probably one of the best experiences I've had sitting down having a conversation with anybody that I can remember in quite a long time. So I really hope that you guys enjoy, and so let's check it out. Love is the law, love under will. With Frater Orpheus, and today we're going to be talking about your book on the rights of man. And I sat down, I've had the book, and my fiance has a nice book that you gifted him, like the leather-bound version. So I've taken a look at that. They're both beautiful. I've gone through it. I've made notes. I got questions. And just before we get into that, I want to hear, tell us about you first. Who is Frater Orpheus? What do you do? Magically, what are you inclined to? What are your pursuits? Obviously, Liber OZ is something that you're very into. Go ahead, let us know, just a little bit.
I don't know if there's much to say about me. I worked as a supervisor for the county as a professional, and I retired from that a few years ago. And I'm pretty much just a homemaker nowadays. I'm a lifelong, or essentially lifelong, Thelemite. I came upon Crowley's writings like when I was in 5th grade. I started having some outer body type experiences and started researching what the astral was all about, and came across Crowley's writings, and pretty much been reading him ever since I was a child, essentially. And in my early teens became, a little more serious. By my late teens, I was identifying as a Thelemite, but still didn't even know that any O.T.O or any other organization existed. In the early 90s, found out that they did indeed exist, and joined the O.T.O in 95, though I started hanging out at Thelema Lodge and 418 Lodge around 93-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And
now, as a teen, it's interesting. It's like, Thelema is a fairly open-minded religion. Crowley was somebody he drank, he used, and when I think of teenagers, now you grew up in the States, I'm assuming, right?
Yes. I grew up in California.
Okay. So it's like, as a teenager, people are more inclined to like party, make a lot of mistakes. And it's interesting when I hear people, when they were teenagers, they talk about they got drawn to spirituality, you know.
Yeah. Well, I
Did
was
it
doing a lot of
conflict and
drugs too,
like,
so
sure,
I
well,
was
that's
doing.
why I mentioned it. It's like it goes hand in hand with Thelema in a sort of way. They're mind
Yeah,
opening, mind enhancing, emotional enhancing substances, you know, so it
certainly,
can go with
certainly.
spirituality. Did
Yeah.
you find it in conflict with like peers, or like what was your experience
No.
with that? Like practicing spirituality as a youth when not many people are doing that, you know? It's interesting.
I was born uh, naturally inclined to being open-minded, I guess you could say. I mean, I went to private Catholic schools and Jesuit. I was studying to be a priest all the way until like 15, 16 when I decided, that maybe it wasn't the right direction for me. But up until then, I was spending my summers in monasteries and whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
and so even steeped in Christianity, I had no conflict with Thelema, as odd as that might sound. I was attracted to the writings of Buddha very, very, very young too. So
Mm-hmm.
I've always been able to just kind of accept truth wherever I find it. And there just reached a point where Thelema made more sense to me than the Christian stuff, and I just I moved over into that column, so to speak.
Sure. And I mean, maybe to somebody like that's never gotten so deep into the actual symbolism or great work of Thelema, but any kind of religion, like I was watching, I'm not gonna mention who was on the podcast, but I was listening to a lecture earlier today, and the person made the point of saying like, you could be a Thelemite and more inclined to Gnosticism or Christianity or Satanism or Buddhism or kind of
Sure,
whatever.
absolutely. It's a
Pick and choose.
philosophical principle.
Right, right,
Yeah, and
right.
so my interest in Thelema didn't come. The reason I brought up that other stuff is because it wasn't the partying and the rebels teen years that led me to Thelema. It was very early on attraction to the spiritual idea that we essentially guide ourselves.
Right. I understand it. I understand it too. Like I had a similar as a child, as I went to Catholic school growing up, Roman Catholic school. So it was, I remember like eighth grade. Um, Now I've transitioned some like 7 years ago, 6, 7 years ago, but
Yeah,
I had like the calling. Like I remember being in religion class, where they taught you a little bit about the Bible or people from different mythos from the Bible. And I remember the teacher sharing that, for people who become priests in the they were only talking about Catholicism, but people that become priests in that religion, they tend to describe having a calling to the priesthood, and they just know that they have to go. And I had that calling, but it wasn't going to work for me because I knew like my identity was in full conflict with the overall views of how you're supposed to live your life according to that religion. And
yeah,
so it kind
sure.
of freaked me out. I don't know if
But you
you
were
relate
drawn
to
to a
that.
spiritual path while you were young.
Absolutely. There was a
Yeah,
calling that I was fearful to act on because I thought that that was going to lead me to having to be a person that I wasn't. You know what I mean?
yes, essentially the same thing to me. I was
Hmm.
spiritually inclined as a child. I used to spend hours circumambulating in the church, because I get dropped off at school early before
Hmm.
school started, so I'd have the church to myself, and I used to just circumambulate in there and essentially meditate. So I always have felt a connection to divinity, and that never really changed.
Mm.
So, when I came across Crowley's writings, I was having clearly intense astral experiences that nobody could answer. So I had to go to a library and figure it out for myself.
Right.
And so, Crowley just kind of fell into my lap that way. And,
Right.
I'm happy that, it's my path.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so moving, I guess we could go a little bit into Liber OZ. When was the first time? I'm not sure if you mentioned in the book. Like, when was your first time coming across the text Liber OZ? What was your first thoughts on it? Because as far as I know, nobody's written a book on it. Plenty of people
Yeah,
have talked about it, but to actually do the research you did, it's
yeah.
an incredible amount of work.
The first time I came up on Liber OZ, I was probably around 8th grade or so. Because, even though I came across Crowley in 5th, 6th grade, at that time I was mostly reading stuff about people that wrote about him. You know what I mean? It wasn't until like around 7th or 8th grade, I actually used to call into Weiser's. I was like 12 years old, and Donald would answer the phone, and I place orders, and that's how I first started getting Crowley's actual books. And so Oz I couldn't have seen any earlier than probably 8th grade to freshman year, but I remember reading it early on. And I think my original take would be the same as most people. You mostly see it on a mundane kind of a level. And, it's a kind of a statement of our general beliefs and rights and these kinds of things. But I certainly didn't think deeply upon it until much more recently when I wrote the book.
Sure. Now, Crowley, he writes that this is both the war aim and the peace aims, as you definitely pointed that out, and most people refer to it as like the war aims.
I think it's funny that a lot of people in the Thelema community tend to focus on one side
on the
of
one
the
side of it,
equation,
but not the peace aims.
and they almost ignore the other piece.
Well, I think it's implied, but it's not really, because we live in a very aggressive world. Everything's fighting for life, even nature. Trees are fighting for space. If you want to, you kind of look at it that way. Whichever one's getting the most sunlight is getting the most. It's kind of like a fight to survive.
That's half the equation.
Right, but people don't look at, well, what are we actually fighting for as humans? What comes after that? Is there a moment of peace?
Crowley, that was the very first time he writes that. It's in his journal, and he puts the two together, almost contemplatively. The war aims of Thelema, and then as an afterthought, or maybe better said, the peace aims. You know what I mean? He's kind of thinking about it. I can't remember the exact initial quote. It's probably there in the book. But he clearly sees that it's both sides. That in truth, establishing these rights would bring peace to mankind.
Right. And even with like the Book of the Law, for example, it seems like Crowley took this so seriously to the point that he believed that this was going to be the solution for fixing what we have going wrong in the world. All of the craziness, absolutely. The quarrels, the fights. Now we're seeing things like climate change and etc. And he really firmly believed that the way to fix this was through Liber OZ, or through Thelema.
He was all in. He was all in. When essentially a student asked a question about Oz, where she intuitively knew that it could be implied inwardly, but just hadn't figured out how. You know what I mean? And or what that would look like. She just asked me, basically, could it be implied inwardly? And that made me start thinking about it. And I had one of those kind of epiphany moments where a bunch of information comes flooding through when you ask the right question to your angel, essentially.
Right.
And I wrote out about 9 or 10 pages real quickly of all the amazing stuff about Oz I had not considered. And I responded back to her. And essentially everything that's in the book came from that and the letter. It's just been expounded and clarified because, right away I realized there was so much information that you could see in Oz if you looked at it close enough, that I could only give her kind of an outline of everything that was in there, and told her that I was going to write a book because I knew right then that there was a ton of information on it. Initially, the idea was that these notes would remain private, and the idea of publishing them never crossed my mind. I shared the notes with Heydrich, and he agreed that they should be published. So that's what made me think about it.
Started off, well, so you had first talked to the sister. she led you to write notes, and then you ended up giving a lecture back. What was it, 2015?
Yeah, oh, well, the lecture came out in the middle of that whole thing. So first she asked me the question. I came up with all the ideas and notes, and then decided, okay, this needs to be written out in some kind of formal matter. So I turned that into like a 15, 25 page pamphlet or something. I'd have to pull one out to remember how many pages, but it was just a little staple bound booklet that was passed around internally to students and that kind of a thing. And then people, like Heydrich and whatnot, took a look and said, hey, this could, maybe you should expand upon this. This is some good information.
This is Bill Heydrich in California?
Yeah. And at that same time, Bob Stein was inviting me out to his house. And Bob likes to kind of test you. So literally like 24 or 48 hours or something like that before I was flying out to his house, he told me that he wanted me to lecture on Liber Modus while I was there visiting for the lodge. And I would have been happy to, of course, but Pyramid Lodge is one of the things that they've done over the years is intently tear that ritual apart. Like they've looked at it inside and out. So I didn't know how much
ritual you're referring to?
That would be new. You know what I mean?
Are you referring to the mass, the Gnostic mass, or
no? To Liber Modus.
Oh, okay. To pyramid. Okay.
I got. They call themselves Pyramid Lodge.
Pyramid Lodge. Okay. Yeah. Oh, I didn't know where the name came from.
It came from Liber Modus, and they really have studied that ritual as a group.
Okay.
And a lot of people have come through and lectured on it, and Bob himself has written a pretty intense paper on it, though I don't think that's available publicly. Okay. Nonetheless, when on my way out, he asked if I would, share some of my ideas about Modus, and I agreed initially, and then I started thinking about that fact. I was like, well, what am I going to tell these guys? They've been looking at it for decades.
Yeah, people are 40, 50, between 2 or 3 of the members, well over 100 years.
Yeah, there's some.
Thelema.
Yeah, exactly. Some old timers over there.
Right.
And at that time, I already had the pamphlet generated, and I was sitting on all this new Oz material, and I was already kind of considering it because of Heydrich's comments of maybe turning it into a publication for the O.T.O. And I said, you know what, Bob, I got all these notes on Oz. Why don't I share those? And so then I went to his house and gave the lecture, and that gave me a sense of what people really wanted to hear, what they liked and didn't like, what needed to be more clarified and expanded upon, and all that. So the pyramid lecture and Heydrich's, especially on a certain level, Felicia Heydrich's input onto my actual writing, because she saw the first draft and pointed out that I needed to work quite a bit on my writing. I don't, writing's not my profession. So between those two folks, I took their feedback and I ran with it. I suggested it to Sabazius at Anoticon as a fundraiser for O.T.O. He liked the idea, HB liked the idea, and so then I wrote the book.
And then how'd you go about publishing? Did you do it through the order, through self-publish?
The publication aspect of it was a little challenging because I wanted full control of it.
Sure.
So I wanted to decide the colors. I wanted it to be printed in full color. I wanted to do a hardbound leather type version and all this stuff. And I wanted to do it oversized. You see how big it is. It was only the paperbacks that I really didn't, you can only do so much with those.
Sure.
And they were also going to be limited in number. That was part of the deal all along. There's some photos and stuff under there. There's multi folks that I had to get copyright permission from. So the deal was always that it was going to be a limited edition because of all the material that's in there. I contemplated putting out another scaled down version.
That was going to be my next question. At this point, is it sold out? And
it's sold out except for in paperbacks.
Okay.
I haven't looked at the numbers, but we're supposed to yank the paperbacks, once they reach a certain number.
Okay.
And so I'll have to see where that's at. It's probably not much longer, but it could
Sure.
be. It
Sure.
could be a while still.
Okay. So there are still paperbacks available, and then there is, at least on your part, consideration of second edition.
Yeah, a scaled back edition, which would keep the beef, the material, you know, like the history in my metaphysical analysis, but it would lose like all the extra libers and the translations and that kind of stuff. I could cut the print in half essentially if I got rid of
Gotcha.
uh, a lot of the stuff that was in dependencies and stuff like the letters and those kinds of things.
Now, I know you did like, what was it, like 500 of the regular hardcovers and then 156 of the leather. Was there also like the
No. It
11?
was much less than that. It was
Okay.
I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it was
Okay.
like 33 or something like that of the hards, maybe 44 of the
Oh,
leathers, and
okay.
156 of the hardbacks, and
Okay.
333 of the paperbacks.
Oh, okay. Okay, I gotcha. I gotcha. So I want to jump into like the initial material. And I got a note here. It's not very long, just a couple sentences. I'll kind of paraphrase it. And it's that it's touching on the forward by Kaczynski, Richard Kaczynski. It made me angry starting off the book. Just his forward, or yeah, the forward. Um, and it's that we live in a world full of injustices. It's like in Russia, Africa, Brazil, right now, people of LGBT, and then if you look at other minority groups, or if you look at in Africa, the way Europeans have treated Africans over the centuries, the way people in the Americas have treated people not of European or Euro-Indo descent, Caucasian descent. Um, it's just miserable. So you have, for example, LGBT people being rounded up in certain countries. I believe Ethiopia is one of the worst. There's several countries in Africa that are just absolutely horrible to people just for their sexuality, which is, one of the main tenets in Liber OZ, one of the main sections. Man has the right to love who he will. So people all over the world are afraid of being themselves. So they're either hiding or they become monsters in order to fit in, and because they're filled with such hate for themselves because of their peers, and that's what their peers have told them about people like them, that they're just boiling with anger and self-hatred, and that comes out in all these like crazy and just ruthless and savage ways. And so people are afraid of their own identities, and they target vulnerable people and they justify their violence based on social or religious indoctrination. And so, as I began to read into Kaczynski's forward, it was like I just got filled with such anger at like the state of the world and the state of people, as a whole, the human race. You know,
Absolutely. I mean, the driving force for me has always been that exact same thing. If Heydrich once said to me that if you want to make a change in the world, you have to work really hard at it,
mm,
even a little change,
mm,
right? So and Magick's all about causing change on this plane and on some level. And so a part of Oz was certainly tied up in my own personal work is my way of passing on the sword and the hope that
mm,
humanity can learn to better themselves.
absolutely. See, the other thing too, like there's the koan you made me think of, that a trickle of water eventually will carve a hole through a mountain, you know?
Yeah.
So it comes down to like there's a little poem or like a little thing at the beginning of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn book, or at least like the second edition or third edition or something. And it goes on to say that the only thing that will guarantee any type of success, no matter what you're doing, is persistence, you know, and just
Exactly.
constant persistence. And sometimes it does take a lot of work.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, you really never know how much change you'll have in the world outside of self. But I know
Right.
that going through the process for oneself, it changes you. So,
Right.
so that was the benefit, is that I really don't think we carry over anything into the next incarnation that we haven't put into actual practice.
Hmm.
And that's the power of Oz, is that it's
Hmm.
something that you can put into practice. So me writing the book was, putting pen to paper, was very much about it, changing my internal magical world, and hoping that had kind of an effect on the outer as well.
Sure.
But
Well,
there's
it's like
no way to
Crowley.
know that.
Yeah,
But
like Crowley, he didn't see the mass of his work. Like he had successes throughout his magical career,
yeah,
but not to the degree that from the 1980s on, after the reboot of the O.T.O by Hymenaeus Alpha, and then other Thelemic orders coming out, and now today, there's more Thelemites on the face of the earth than there's ever been. It's not to say that it's a large community that's currently competing with any of the quote unquote mainstream religions, but he changed himself in the process. And then it came to a point where towards the end of his life, or at least like when he was in Berlin and stuff, in the Tobias Churton book, Crowley in Berlin, there
yes.
was a period where Crowley was like, or at least according to Churton and diaries and everything, that Crowley was depressed. It was like he felt he might have failed the great work, or
He
his
certainly
doing his
questioned
will.
whether
And
he had
sure,
wasted his time or not.
right,
But
right.
he had
But
no
at the end,
choice but to labor forward, and he did.
yeah, it's like your will is your will. It doesn't matter what's going to happen. You got to do it. At the end
There,
of the
there,
day.
there is a wisdom that sets upon him, though, in the 40s.
Mhm.
Um, where he's not the guy that is written about in those books. You know what I mean?
Okay, sure.
The way that he loved his son, the way that he writes about his last lovers, and these kinds of
Mhm.
things. Crowley was a passionate, caring soul in the way that he's not always portrayed to be, and
Right,
that's certainly the way Grady spoke of him. And
right.
I think that people that were with him at the later ends, like Harris. I mean, Harris's letter that she wrote when he passed away is beautiful. You can tell that she
Mhm.
cared. So Crowley's not this great beast that he's painted up to be. And
No,
Oz is written
absolutely
in the
not.
40s, when he's at that prime, when he's at
Yep.
his most wisest.
Right now, it comes at a time period where he put out, well, he didn't actually get to publish it, but Magic Without Tears, he had gotten to write the letters that went into its publication in the
Yes.
1950s. And
Yeah.
he wrote the Book of Thoth, and he finally published Liber OZ. It's like those are, if I'm not mistaken, those are the last three Libers that he published.
Yeah.
And they're the most mind blowing, probably. And he's got some mind blowing literature, but they're
Yeah, I mean,
dense.
those are
Each
some
one
major
of them are dense.
contributions to Thelema. There's no
Yeah.
question about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So like it's true. There was a not so subtle wisdom and just something about the man at the end that it was, yeah, the magic worked upon him. Whatever was going to happen to the world, whether um it was all in his head that this was going to be the means to save humanity from the calamities that we're bringing upon ourselves or not, he had changed himself, and that's the great work in a nutshell. You know,
yeah,
it done
absolutely.
magic.
Back to Richard's intro,
Mhm.
though.
Yeah,
Uh, first time I read it, I thought it was pretty amazing too. And of course, shout out to him for agreeing to write the intro. I was, of course, honored,
sure.
as much as he said, I think he wanted to say more. It was right in the middle of all the divisions that our country's had to face in the last couple of years. We were at the heat of the riots and stuff,
Hmm.
and so we discussed pulling back a little bit on the intro, so not to add too much fuel to the fire that because people politicize those issues that he brings up,
Sure,
not
sure.
realizing that that they're issues that should be important to all humans, no matter what political party they follow.
Right, right. Especially for Thelemites, every man and every woman is a
Absolutely,
star, and we should be living
absolutely.
up to that standard.
I totally agree with that. So I think he did a wonderful job. It's short and it's strong, and to get your juices flowing right before the book. So it's
Yeah.
clearly served its purpose.
just his forward having that emotional effect on me, because the gravity of this text is like, we really are living in a world where there's a lot of love, but there's also a lot of hate, you know, and there's a lot of injustice, and there's a lot of places that even within this country, in the US, it is called the land of liberty, and there's some issues that you could bring up that it's like, wait, where does liberty start and where does liberty end? And you know, what I'm trying to say is, for some people, the land of liberty is not so much the land of liberty in some cases, you know.
Of course
But
not. You touched on that earlier with your own experiences, and
exactly,
you know. But of course, when those injustices exist, anger will spill over. You know, and
right.
the world is divided because we're at the end of the old Aeon. You know, it's dying, and it's not going away easy. We're in that
It's like
transition into the new Aeon. We're
the
not in the
patriarch
new
just doesn't
Aeon
want
yet.
to admit its own defeat, and so it's trying to claw and take one more belly, you know, it's on its stomach trying to crawl forward just one more step, you know, and it's like, just lay there, it's okay, you have some dignity. But were there any moments going through when you were writing this book, that any emotional periods due to the nature of the work that ever came up for you? I was just curious about that.
Not
Not
in the way. I wouldn't say not in these ways. No.
Okay. It was more like just a scholastic work, in other words.
No, if the magical aspects of it. See, the project came together. They're multi-tiered. That's why there was so much information. I don't know if I would have researched the project or as well as I did had I not been involved in so many different projects simultaneously. Because at the same time I was researching the book, I was traveling to Heidrich's house on a regular basis to scan in journals from the O.T.O archives and help him relocate him. The archives needed to be relocated a little bit. I can't give too much info there, but he needed help to take care of the archive. So I went out there and helped him. I did some scanning, and in that process, I scanned every single Oz I could find in his archive. So for those are all available on the Liber OZ, or at least a bunch of them are available on the Liber OZ project site. In truth, I got a couple hundred more that I haven't updated there yet because it's just one of many projects. But
speaking of which,
what's that?
Just to jump in on that topic really quick, speaking of which, reading this book and then knowing that we were going to sit down and do this interview, I made 2 of my own Liber OZs. One is still in the work, and I'm actually going to distribute. I've been doing a lot of Mercury work with the zodiac, so like the sphere of the Magus, kind of this idea of the Ruach being the center of the zodiac. I've been kind of working with that idea in ritual and a lot of Liber Israfel type stuff. So I made a lot of mercurial imagery on a Liber OZ, and then I'm also doing one for the Congregation of the Lamp of Invisible Light. So that one's still
wonderful.
In the works,
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
See,
so I'm going to be.
I have tons of little stories
soon.
like this, you know. Over the years, different Thelemites and O.T.O groups and lodges have come up with different versions of Oz and distribute them at, you know, various places in their communities. And there's all kinds of fun little stories out there that I have all recorded that hopefully one day I'll get all on the website so people could see some of the very fun ways Oz
beautiful.
Oz has
That's
been
a beautiful thing.
over
Hearing
the last
people,
50 years.
Yeah, hearing the people of like why they chose this document at this time, or what was the creativity that went into designing this, you know, their issue of it. That's super cool. I think this, like, people's stories are not so much recorded. Sometimes they are, but I feel like people need to put their stories out more if they're comfortable, because it gives people something to identify with. You know?
Well, that's what I'm hoping the site stimulates that, at least as far as Oz. But and that's liberozproject.com for everybody out there who's listening. You might want to take a peek. I haven't seen it.
I'll post a link definitely in the description for sure.
Yeah, but anyhow, since I was simultaneously involved in this very historical research, literally down to cataloging Oz's, at the same times I was studying it metaphysically. is why the book emerged the way it did. You know what I mean? I was like, well, I could put all of this stuff together, and now it's a book. You know.
Right.
So it was not meant to be a scholarly thing. In fact, initially it started as a completely metaphysical response to a student. And then later, all this other stuff was added on because I was doing all that research on Oz as well. But what happened is that once, because I didn't know there was going to be a book or anything valuable to tell about Oz until I had all the letters, and I basically went into the archives and pulled out every mention of Oz on every single document I could find. And correlated them in order, and then just put the whole story together. And I realized that there was a fascinating story there. You know, there was like, this is cool the way it came about. There was all these little things I didn't know. They're not in any bio, you know, because there's so much to research. Nobody had really dug into how Oz came about.
Right.
And if there wasn't anything in the archives, or it was a boring story, I wouldn't have told it. But
Sure.
I thought it was fascinating, so I was like, I'm gonna write about this.
So Crowley starts by publishing the V sign, right? He calls himself the author of the V sign. It was the Christmas card, and he made one for people in the order and one for people not in the order. So he had different O.T.Os. One was the devil, and one was the Aeon card, but without Harpocrates kind of painted into the painting. And there was, like you mentioned, that there's a debate whether there's a separate O.T.O painting that we didn't know about, or if it was the same painting, just not finished. But
yeah, well, because there is another version of that a card without Hippocrates. But if you look at that well-known version, it's also different in other places, like the children and the wings and these kinds of things. So it's not that alternate version.
Gotcha.
So it either has to be a lost painting, or it has to be the one that was originally published, or that is published with the Thoth deck just prior to, you know, her painting on Hippocrates.
Sure thing. Are any of those Oz cards still extant today, or are they missing, destroyed?
What do you mean? What the original
like
Oz cards?
The original first 1941 devil?
Oh yeah, I have a set in my collection.
Okay. I was wondering about that, if they were just pictures that you had gotten, or if you actually had a physical copy of the first one.
See, that was another reason
they are still extant.
That was part of how the catalog came out, was that a collector in New York who's a dealer was having some trouble identifying exactly what editions were what editions, because nobody had bothered cataloging all the Oz cards. So nobody even knew exactly how many first editions there were, in which order they came out. So in answering that question for that dealer, I learned how many Oz cards there were and what order they came out. And that's how that material ended up getting put into the book, because I had done that research prior for a book dealer. But yeah, all the Oz postcards are out there. People collect them. Those first editions sell for about $750 plus, depending on condition. They're a little hard to come by. The devil one's damn near impossible, because there was only 50 of those. Right. That's the rarest one.
Right.
The Aeon cards do come up from time to time. You know, you got to pay attention to the dealers like Weiser and whatnot, the folks that specialize in that stuff, and wait till the right people are selling them their stuff off, you know, like Culpepper did not so long ago. And when those kinds of folks start, you know, emptying their archives, these things will pop up, you know.
Sure. So I have a question with the creation of Liber OZ now. And it's relating kind of to chapter 2. Chapter 2, you mentioned you spent a lot of time writing about, like, the World War II was coming on, and World War II was coming, and Crowley had spent a lot of time in World War I trying to be a part of it, and there's, you know, a whole bunch of debates on his involvement in the war, but he was very interested in it for magical reasons, mundane reasons. The point of chapter 2, speaking on the war, do you feel like World War II coming about was the main reason that Crowley published Liber OZ?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's what he said himself.
Mhm.
If there was no World War II, we probably wouldn't have Oz. He was inspired by two things specifically: a protest against the fascism, and I can't remember the exact quote there, but it's in the book, and the fact that they had instituted a day of prayer in England. So you know that it was like the second or third day, and Crowley was just fed up with it. Where literally the entire nation would like take a holiday and supposedly pray, and Crowley's thought of that as like a sign of a weakness and an affront to Aeonic thinking and these kinds of things. So that's where he writes that really funny quote that's in the book about it being a response to the, you know, the gas, essentially, this of the those who are a member of a dead cult or something like that. You know, I can't remember the line. But so it's specifically against the war and against this old Aeonic kind of idea that still had a stronghold on humanity and still does. And he earnestly, magically, intently created Oz to turn that upside down, to subvert old Aeonic thinking and put an end to fascism.
Well, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit now because the point you just bring up is kind of funny. Like later on, way towards the end of the book, it's like he sends students. You mentioned you wrote a bit about it. He sends students out with the job of taking Liber OZ and giving it to random people, either people they know or strangers, and recording what their reaction was to it.
Yes.
And somebody wrote, "Oh my God, that's fascism," and it's like. Oh my goodness, like, and I don't think people have changed that much today. It's like if you took this to the average person, like I don't think they'd know what to make of it. You
No,
know?
they wouldn't at all. What happened at that particular time, and it should be an interest of members of O.T.O as well. But what Crowley did was there was this thing called the Mass Observation Project, and you can Google that, and the archives from the Mass Observation Project mostly is all online, and it's just this huge archives of interviews and film and all this data that they collected across all of English society, and it's a social experiment. So you know it focuses on social issues, and part of it became kind of a fad and a craze. So everybody was into it. And part of that way of collecting data was that people would go around on the streets with these little postcard kind of sized papers with questions on them and interview people and then report back the stats. And they would, you know, anything from like bathroom proclivities to sexual preferences and stuff. They would take these little polls across all of English society and then record the data. And everybody, you know, so it was a fad. Everybody was fascinated by it. So Crowley just piggybacked onto that and suggested specifically members of the O.T.O go out and take copies of Liber OZ and post them everywhere about town and interview people and engage their reactions to it. As far as we could tell, only one person really took them seriously. But in America, Agape Lodge immediately took Oz under, Smith and published a copy, he out of his own, with his own funds. Crowley didn't like it so much, but it's still the first American edition. And more importantly, the folks at Agape Lodge adopted it into their normal ritual. Like they would open and close their lodge meetings and stuff by reciting Oz aloud together.
Interesting.
And it's about that time that we think that it probably worked its way into usage in the way that the O.T.O uses it nowadays, because it kind of mirrors all that kind of stuff.
On usage, it's interesting because like it's one thing to apply it, but like I've actually used parts of Liber OZ as a mantra at one point.
I like that.
Yeah, I'll explain. It's like when I was in early transition, I agree. I'm transgender, so I grew up in a Roman Catholic, Irish, Polish, Italian neighborhood where, like, that was not even thought of. But being gay was like the worst thing ever. It was like trans people didn't exist. Like, we don't even acknowledge that as a reality. But if you're gay, like, you are in serious trouble. So that type of mentality. So I had to
Yeah,
like really uproot some seriously deep planted self-hatred that
of
society
course.
put into me from childhood.
It's
And
good that you took that on. I mean,
mhm,
the
I
generation just
didn't
prior
have a
to
choice.
yours,
Hmm.
the generation just prior to yours, like folks about my age,
Sure,
uh,
sure. I'm
had
30, so
much less
people,
outlets.
40s and older, yeah. Yeah,
They
oh
had
yeah.
much less
Right.
outlets.
Yeah.
I lost several friends who never won that battle. You know,
Hmm.
either to
So,
drugs or other
right,
issues
that's,
because, and it's
yeah.
sad. That
It leads to serious depression when you can't be yourself.
yeah,
And when you're telling
absolutely.
people this is who I am, and you're either getting hatred or pushed away, or worse, when somebody says they'll support you, and that means absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Or it means I'm gonna go behind your back and talk about you when you're not here. you know? So like at least it's here. But that one line, man has the right to dress as he will, it's like when I was in early transition, I would have to repeat that line to myself probably like 10, 20 times before I even left the house, walked out of the front door. And when I was in public, and either like I was getting looks from people, either because like I was now a female, representing as female, and then or they were clocking me. So it's like I couldn't just tell if they were looking at me for me or me because I'm trans. And so it's like my head was like really obsessed with everybody whose eyes flashed to me. There was sudden fear that I had to learn to control. And so I have to use the mantra again, man has the right to dress as he will, man has the right to dress as he will. Until I got to a place of like internal comfort where I really just stopped caring what people think. But it took some time, and it took some serious work
That's
to uproot
that's a
that.
beautiful thing.
Mhm.
If Crowley was aware that you use that one line from that Liber as a mantra to uh, in your own personal work, that would have
Mhm.
been enough for him to have written that Liber. He would be satisfied with just that fact
Just that it
alone.
helped one person, and I'm
Yeah.
sure like I can't be the only one. I'm sure this text has
I
hit
know, yeah,
how
you're
many
not, but
hundreds and thousands of people. Yeah, so it's just
it's so
incredible.
interesting to me because me as a hetero male, that
Mhm.
line doesn't seem nearly as transformative as some of the others. You know what I mean?
Right,
But I
right,
could see how for you personally, it's a powerful, beautiful thing.
right.
Oz is an amazing thing. If people embrace it, truly embrace Oz, uh, it can change them.
See, I had a magical teacher who he was not in any Thelemic order in the end of his life. He was just solitary, but he had done many things, Golden Dawn and a bunch of stuff, in his years. And when I first started working with him, he just kept enforcing, did you read Liber OZ today? Are you committing it to memory? How are you living Liber OZ? Like those would be the first things he'd ask for, like as soon as we'd start a phone call, like for the beginning of our relationship, like making sure he really impressed upon me the importance of the short text. Like you need to learn this and you need to apply it and you need to try your best to live it in a way that people see it and it might rub off on them if they choose to.
No, I get that.
Yeah.
Is one of the beautiful things that Moda had going for him.
Hmm.
Moda pushed Oz constantly, and a lot of those who follow in his footsteps have as well.
Hmm.
And I noticed that from that side of the fence, so to speak, that
Hmm. Sure.
Oz. I mean, even in his private letters, Moda is pushing Oz all the time,
Hmm.
almost as it's the most important thing to do. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Well, in a sense, it might be because not everybody's gonna practice hermetic, Kabbalistic magic, Thelemic magic, you know. But people, no matter what you're doing with your life, if you're living a spiritual life or not, you could do these things and find some type of gratification from it for sure,
Yeah,
even if you're
that's
not
why it's for all of
understanding.
mankind.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful document. And I think that it's perfect that Crowley didn't, some people try to uh, look at Oz as something less because it's not class A or something.
Sure.
I think it's really Crowley at his very best. You know, his sword is at its sharpest. It's a beautiful, concise, succinct document that is powerful, that anybody can apply in their life. And because of it's so layered in its mysteries, it speaks to you no matter where you are in your individual path, beginner or a hermit.
I have a very interesting question, or it's interesting to me because I like the nerdy little details, and I've never thought of this until just now. Being that it's not class A, B, C, D, etc. Right? Was it published by O.T.O? And is
Yeah.
that the
So,
reason it was not in any particular class of publication?
huh.
That's something that never
That's a good
actually
reason
crossed
why
my
Crowley
mind.
might not have put it in a classification. You know, I never thought of it in that angle. That's at least conceivable. I'd have to
Hmm.
really look back, because the Crowley never assigned libers to anything he published directly through OTO.
Hmm.
I can't recall that, but I've never tried to address that question specifically.
Never
So I'll have
occurred
to
to me
look at
until
that a
you
little
mentioned it. Yeah.
closer. But it's at
Hmm.
least possible that's why he didn't assign an actual liber. Uh,
Hmm.
but
So
my sense it was published by OTO because OTO was the only thing that was really going on at the time, you
sure,
know, and he was trying to
sure,
promote the order, you know.
sure, sure,
AA
sure.
was down to like 4 dudes or something, you know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Towards the end of his life. It was getting the numbers were very low, and it was kind of
Yeah, a
just
handful of
California
people.
as the last hope.
And I
You
shouldn't
know.
say dudes either, because they weren't all. In fact, they were
Hmm.
mostly women towards the end of his
Hmm.
life.
Hmm.
Uh, very few numbers is what I meant there.
Yeah. Getting onto the content, in an interesting way, you had mentioned that the 5 sections, he had tried to apply them Kabbalistic, and he was kind of dissatisfied with his results of
Yeah.
whether or not they should be put on the tree or not. Um, and I didn't see this in the book, but whenever I see the number 5, it's always I think of Pentagrammaton, but I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think that maybe they're attributed to the elements of any type, but you did have a couple of interesting um, placements of them, whether it was from Malkuth up towards Tiferet, you know,
Yeah.
or etc.
There are several
I even
permeations, of course, that didn't make the book. I think what happened there was that um, the document that it originally pulled from, which is called the Rights of Man, I can say that because it is HB and Sabazius have both published some details. What was divided in 22 lines, which could, in a manner similar to uh, lines in Pure Modus, be applied to the tree of life, the 22
hmm
paths.
right 22
And
paths.
and so we know that there was, even from the beginning, a Kabbalistic influence. I think Crowley decides to write Oz, in which he's going to kind of re-edit and beg and borrow from some of this past stuff.
Hmm.
And he says, well, I'm going to project it on the tree of life. So we know that he projected it on the tree of life, and he divided it into these 5 sections, but he also wasn't entirely comfortable with the way it worked out. And it doesn't explain that why. But when in my own metaphysical analysis, of course, I had to start putting them on the tree and seeing how they worked and didn't work. And I think I understand what he meant by that, because so many of the ways that you could project Oz onto the tree seem to work, except for this doesn't fit or that don't fit. So
Right.
it kind of clumsily fits on the tree. And literally what you're looking at is my 4th or 5th permeation after a good year of living with different samples of what I came down to what I thought was the best way to apply it to the tree. But some of the planetary attributes and stuff, that they could work in other ways too, and I think that's why Crowley struggled with projecting it onto the tree. He wanted that symbology, but it didn't fit so cleanly always. And certain lines, could arguably fit in other places.
Right. I have another question with because in the commentary that to the Book of the Law that was published by I guess it was Hymenaeus Beta that put it out, if I'm not mistaken. Um, I forget what verse it is, but there's a verse in the commentaries of Liber L that he actually put something very similar to Liber Oz, just worded slightly different.
That was in the magical and philosophical commentaries, and it also was included in Regardi's early
Right.
Laws for All. We got one of the earlier editions.
Right. Was that was that like a precursor to Oz, or was that post Oz?
First of all, none of the publications of the commentaries are complete. All of them are edited. It doesn't matter which version that you have. And sometimes there's rhyme or reasons as to why things are left in or out. So there's, we don't know exactly why Regardi would have chosen to keep it in and why other people have chosen to keep that particular commentary out. But if you happen to own a copy of that, then you'll notice that yes, there is a particular line in chapter 2. I can't remember exactly which one. It might be, I might mention it in a footnote in the book, where a list very similar is published, because it's, it correlates also back to the Rights of Man document. Okay. So it is pre-Oz.
Sure, probably Cefalu time, because I know he was doing, he would take cocaine as a sacrament, as a mercurial sacrament, do some invocations, and then sit down, do cocaine, and then start writing commentaries.
Yeah, off the top of my head, the O.T.O.
That was like 21, 22.
Yeah, the O.T.O. stuff was written around 1915.
Okay, so yeah, it was like his mercurial magus years he was claiming the magus grade around that time period.
Yep. Okay. Maybe a little bit after.
Gotcha. This might be a little bit of a weird question. If you don't have an answer to it, I could always edit the section out, but so it's from page 26, and I'll just read what I got written down here. So Crowley writes in this diary about possibilities of a title for Liber Oz, and I'm going to quote from your book, with concentrating on a title for, quote, War Aims card, question mark, goat's milk, parentheses, suckled Jupiter, question mark, Oz in Hebrew, Oz equals 77, equals strength, equals the devil and the lovers, equals the goat. That kind of got me a little bit confused when I was reading it. Goat's milk, suckled Jupiter, the devil and the lovers. What is going on here? Can you kind of break down some of that? Do you understand?
Well, I can just report that that's exactly how Crowley scribbled it in his journal. He didn't explain it either. He's just pontificating, and this is what he's writing down. But if you read into those, you can apply them all to essentially the path of the devil. Which is, very, very much the symbolism that's in the Oz card. I mean, that's in the sense why I wanted to use it. It being that one of the three stages in which ideas manifest as forms. We have to get pretty off target here, but that particular path that sits between Tiphereth and Hode is very mercurial in nature. And the devil card itself, if you look at it, there's the wand of the adeptus is right in it. And that's carried all the way from the full up top. So it's about this mercurial word manifesting into matter, mystery that's being betrayed through that path. So the devil card itself, the mysteries of it relate to the images in your mind manifesting into forms. And how very much of what we think becomes our world. And that's why everything related to the goat and these kinds of things work perfectly with Oz, because Oz is this code of ethics that you could kind of live by when you get in these wishy-washy points of life, when you're deciding which path should I take, left or right, and you're vacillating, you can pull out something like Oz and think about its principles, and it could be a little bit of a guiding light in that.
Sure. See, I in my own practice, I actually sat down and thought about I put it into a Liber Oz context after, but for instance, what type of relationship I wanted. I actually sat down and wrote down like to try to figure out like what is my internal nature and how do I manifest that. So it's like for me, thought manifesting is where the way you put it is very poignant. Is that whatever you think is going to manifest. So it's kind of like the idea I'm saying is if you sit down and organize your thoughts first, you have a better chance of understanding what you're going to manifest or what you need to manifest.
Yeah.
And there's like a class of people walking around today that don't do that. And so they're just kind of going through life, crashing into each other, if you will, out of orbit. And so I got what you're saying. I got you.
It was that a lecture Lon gave once, and I can't remember exactly what the lecture was about, but he talked about threading the eye of the needle. And that eye symbolism as is associated with the path of Ion and the devil card and everything. That idea that you just got to pass things, in this precise little spot if you want to get that thread to go through. You want to, pass through the eye of the needle. To get a camel through the eye of the needle, there's all this mystical symbology. How does one do this? And it's that focus. The devil path represents that focus. And so does Jupiter, and all this stuff is that mercurial word. You could follow that entire path from Aleph down through the devil card. And that's why I mentioned that particular formula in the ritual or in the metaphysical section, because, if you look at Magic and Theory and Practice, that in that chapter, Crowley now takes the word EIO, the formula of EIO, and he maps it onto the tree of life, and he includes the path of Vav. So it becomes Viav.
Right.
But he talks about all four of those paths and how they relate symbolically to Horus, from Horus the child all the way to Horus manifested. And the Adeptus wand is carried throughout all four of those paths: the Fool, the Hierophant, the Hermit, and the Devil. They're all connected in that EIO formula. And we have to read into this, but that's my essential consensus as to why I think that, or my conclusion, not my consensus, that I come to when I say, why did Crowley pick the Devil card? How is that related?
Right. Well, it's interesting because his holy guardian angel Iowas, he associated with Satan. If you look at like the it's not commentaries, but it's footnotes by him to Liber OZ, and you break down Satan as, how I look at it is like it's basically the gatekeeper to your unconscious realm, which is hell. And so it's kind of like you have to be in harmony with it in order to really tap into the recesses of the unconscious mind, where the root of will, which would be the Chachma, right? The sphere of Chachma is like in the unconscious mind beyond the abyss, right? And you kind of have to yank the root or the seed will out of that first, or get that energy out of there first and allow it to kind of trickle down through the certain paths in order to manifest it. So through the connection of the Holy Guardian Angel, his specifically being Iowas, connecting that with Satan, connecting it with Tiferet, and connecting it with the devil path, there's something really to that. And especially those paths of EIO, all being connected to Chachma, Tiferet, etc., like the paths that you mentioned, it's very interesting of getting that seed or that root will from the unconscious mind or from the depths of hell out in manifesting it into the world, or even the devil is the lord of matter, so getting it into that state,
Of course, and then the Z of the Oz, the other letter, is the marriage, which he also mentions in that. Right. And that's the culmination of that formula. Essentially, that's the alchemic marriage. So that's kind of the answer. I'm not sure how far I get into that in the book. But I must have addressed both paths. About it, but okay.
So that's very interesting now, because now I can see how that footnote, everything from the goat to even the strength card being a combination of both the great beast, because it's Crowley in a sense, depicted in the Lust cards, the great beast with Babylon. So it's kind of like the marriage of these two entities in a sort of way, loosely. But I could also see in the sense of what we just talked about, the devil, the lovers, the goat, and strength all being incorporated together right here. So I can see how his footnotes, what his thinking was. So that really helps me understand that line a lot better, because his footnotes, it's you break down some of the stuff and it's genius, but if you don't really know what he was intending with it, it can be very murky. You know?
Yeah, it's a lot of information. I covered some of this stuff at a lecture at Noticon, and I prefaced it with this idea. If you overheard people talking about astrology, and they're talking about squares and aspects, and this is conjunct that, it all sounds like mumbo jumbo. At least astrology, of course. You listen to people talk about Kabbalah, and and all the madness that you can do with gematria and all this kinds of stuff, and it sounds like it's crazy too. But once you really delve into these sciences, then they become sciences, right? Once you understand them and you start applying them and using, after you've been studying astrology for 10 years, it doesn't sound like craziness anymore. It starts to make sense. It's the same thing with these more multi-layered Kabbalistic formulas that Crowley's laying out on the Tree of Life. It's just that it takes a few years of assimilating a lot of information before you can see the beauty of what's being exposed in front of you when he's giving you that formula of EIO. And that is essentially just the O part of the Oz, you know what I mean? But it's all connected. I mean, if you think of the name, the number, the lines, the whole thing together, it's all just one perfect magical talisman of changing the world by our thoughts and our actions. And that's what, I try to give all that there in the metaphysical section, but you're probably just picking up on some of what I meant from this discussion. I wanted to write the book so that anybody from the highest to the lowest could read it and take from it where they were, in their own words. If you make this stuff too unapproachable, then beginners can't read it,
Right. I think you did a good job on that note, because there's enough background information on a mundane level to understand why anybody could use this text and why you would want to. Why liberty is really an important fundamental thing in humanity that we need, and this is definitely a way to get to it. Like, I thought it was really interesting how, now I didn't know this, but I think it was FDR who was president at the time, and he wrote the Rights of Man, which was like so similar, right? That was mind-blowing to me, because I've studied presidential history of this country, but there's just so much, especially like I'm born 91, so I've had to spend a lot of time just to learn, what were the biggest moments in the country's history, and then learning from like Nixon on up until today to really get a good picture of what's going on in this country now as a result of what. So I haven't been able to get into certain things,
our education system does a very poor job of teaching history, and that's probably mostly purposeful, because they don't really want us to know our true history all that well.
No, they wanted people to produce. They were teaching people, depending on where you went to school in this country, it's like they wanted people to produce, to be factory workers or business oriented, so we could produce. Now everything's being produced overseas, so the way that they were educating children is not so applicable today, and they have not revamped the method of education, or what is the most important thing for children to be learning, because it's not production, it's not manufacturing anymore. That's not being done here. It's tech, and technology leads to a whole mess of other things that we could tangent about, but but with FDR, for example. Oh, go ahead.
I was, of course, I was aware of FDR's thing, only because I personally had studied it in another capacity, but I had no idea that Crowley had made any of those connections until I got into the journals and and the letters specific to that period. If Crowley had not drawn that connection, I certainly would not have. But once I saw Crowley correlating it and clearly being specifically inspired by it even, and writing to multiple people, to York, to Harris, and say, hey, take a look at how close this is to what I did. It kind of opened up for me to be able to bring it in, because it's a fascinating connection. And, I was totally unawares of it until I found it in the archives myself. And, the way things, once again, are politically heated out there, I would have never even made that connection suggestively. But Crowley, it's in his own handwriting. He saw the comparison between the two.
I think he wrote letters to York that you have published in your book, where it's like, FDR's. I'll post a picture of it on the video right now. We just got the audio, but I'll post a picture in comparison from what FDR had written as the rights of man to Crowley's Liber OZ, and how Crowley goes into it's basically Liber OZ just watered down for mundane people to understand with no magical implication.
I think the real key to see how much Crowley was influenced by FDR was his original name was The War Aims of Thelema. Where if you looked at all the brochures and different little booklets that were being printed up at the time, promoting FDR's rights, they were entitled The War Aims of America. So there's all this propaganda being pushed around the world that is publishing FDR's rights under the title of The War Aims of America. So the fact that Crowley called Oz The War Aims of Thelema, I don't think that's a coincidence,
Right. Like I actually just pulled it up here, and it was from January 11, 1944, and it basically is broken down into like 6 sections: right to employment, freedom from unfair competition and monopolies, housing, medical care, social security, and education. And that comes down to the same things: the right what to think, the right what to create, the right what to wear. Right. And I mean, it doesn't get into the right to love. They were not privy up to that point, but
of course,
but
very similar.
Then we get into on creating, on the note of creating. You flipped it around. There's no man but God, and I like that. That. I'd never heard anybody say that before. But it's an interesting way of explaining it, because people, when they're coming in new to Thelema and they finally see Liber OZ and they see that line, there's no God but man, it's hard to understand at first if you're not really aware of all the other literature that you got to read to get a good grasp on Thelema. But the way that you just flipped around the 2 words, there's no man but God, like I totally agree. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, it's one of my own metaphysical truths that I apply to everything in life. Whatever is thrown at me, I look at the inverse of it as well, because everything is always 2 sides of the same coin. No matter what's manifested, there's always the unmanifested, so to speak. Yin can't appear without yang. The 2 are always one forever. So anything that it gets thrown at you as far as a spiritual metaphysical truth, it automatically implies the opposite.
Yep.
And that's
just by the nature of thought, by the nature of thought, and by the nature of reality. Yeah, any one thing implies its opposite. It's true.
Exactly. That's a kind of metaphysics 101. So that's what I've always done with Thelema as well, and that's why I immediately got that, and that has always made more sense to me. But I find this to be very true with Crowley, because there's that line in the Book of the Law: the mysteries are half known and half concealed. So when he writes, he does this all the time. He lays out all this stuff, and all you got to do is think of the other half of what he's talking about, and you get the whole picture. And now that I'm aware of certain things, certain mysteries, I can see that that's actually a tool he uses in his writings. Like if you look at that EIL formula and then you look at the opposite of it on the Tree of Life, you realize, well, there's an entire mirrored feminine formula that's flying through the path of the death card, the other side of the on formula. What's the coincidence of that? So whenever you're looking at Crowley, take what's being said and also its polar opposite as both being represented, and I think you'll get a long way in deciphering what he's saying.
That's an interesting thing, and I actually want to look at the Tree of Life after we finish, just to see. I want to take a look at the path, or how you described that. I'm making a note for myself on my calendar.
Well, if you look close enough, you'll notice that the 3 horizontal paths add up to 93.
Right.
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 Well, the paths that are being branched crosswise too. If you just add in that lover's card on one side, and the emperor card on the other side, those add up to 93 too. So there's three 93s, just like 93, 93, 93.
Interesting.
That are all perfectly balanced through the formula or through the paths of Ayin and Noon. One being masculine or active in nature, and the other being passive. And they bridge the pillars. They join the opposite pillars in a single formula, and those mysteries run deep in the Thelemic. That formula is deep in the Thelemic mysteries. So
absolutely.
I'm doing the same thing in my writing. If you look, everything that I wrote in Oz, there's also another half to it.
Okay.
I'm giving you half of it. You got to figure out the other half.
So I'm actually just looking at Liber OZ, and most of the stuff is like straightforward. I mean, we've got the sections. I don't mind being a center of pestilence. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm willing to talk about. Yeah, cool. So definitely want to talk about some of the quoted sections. Liber 77, quote, "The law of the strong, this is our law and the joy of the world." I mean, it's interesting the parts of the Book of the Law that he chose to go into this, because there's a lot of rich soil in Liber, and
yes.
So the law of the strong, and so it's when I see that in Liber OZ right at the top, it's insinuating that Liber OZ is attached directly to the Book of the Law, and that it's attached to the law, and the law is for the strong, or at least that's how my mind is interpreted. That's
what I say all the time too. It's even if it's without classification, there's class A lines on it. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. So it's like a text that's tied very closely to Liber L. So being that this is a method for utilizing the law, right?
Yes.
What is the law of the strong? Like, how do we explain that to somebody who's brand new to Thelema? What is the law of the strong? This is our law and the joy of the world. I don't want to put you on the spot, like break down.
Well, you can read what I wrote right underneath it, and that tells you, my thinking in a nutshell. But the strong is not those who with, the physical might or the weapons or these kinds of things. It's not that kind of strength. The strong are those that have risen to meet the actual changes that they have to make internally.
Right.
That have dealt with their shit.
Yeah, it's like that's the ordeals. It's like when you start on the magical path, especially going through like the AA system, and you start doing specific grade work or achieving a certain level of spiritual insight, and you've attained to a certain degree. There's ordeals that come with like there's shit that has to get uprooted. There's work that has to be done, and it can be very painful on an emotional level. There's a breaking down of character that has to happen before rebuilding occurs. So I agree. It's like it takes a lot. It takes a strong character, or is it that you're made strong after you've gone through this process? Could be, there's always multiple sides to it.
Yeah, the symbolism of being a king is something that's also, comes up quite a bit in Liber OZ. And I think they're basically saying the same thing. Those who are truly kings,
Right.
And what is a king but the person who sets the laws of his land?
Right.
To
be yourself in the face of adversity.
And a king is in charge of every aspect of his own kingdom. Who can he blame any of its failures or successes upon but himself? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So we
Right.
create the parameters of our kingdom, you know.
That ties in. I mean, do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. It's not self-explanatory, but at this point, it's like I feel like we kind of gloss over the statement just because it's been talked about so many places, as has every man and every woman. And then I want to get into like the bulk of Liber OZ, and it's like most of the stuff is very explicit. It's like the right to live by his own law, and has the right to live in the way that he wills to do. And that kind of comes to what we just talked about. It's like you learn your nature, you do your will based on what you learn about that nature. From that information, you're then able to work as you will, to play as you will, to rest as you will, to die when and how you will, which is kind of an interesting one. Obviously, if you're terminally ill, you can't choose to live longer unless there's a treatment for you, and you could choose to take that treatment or not.
Yeah.
But you
There's
could
always
choose
ways to look at all those statements. Of course, you could say maybe the choice was made prior to the incarnation.
Mhm. That way, it's kind of like you choose your incarnation based on what you have karmically to achieve in this lifetime. It's already kind of predestined in a sort of way.
That's very much in line with Greek thought and theory, which
Mhm.
Crowley wasn't entirely in conflict with, and the idea is that before you come into the incarnation, everything's put into place that needs to be there for you to be able to learn whatever it is that you come down here to learn. And the idea of free will and these kinds of things, things aren't predestined, but they're still determined on a certain level. Like for instance, imagine with your child, you give him 4 pairs of pants to choose from. He can pick any pants he wants. He has free will to dress himself every day, but does he really? Because you've chosen all 4 pants for him.
Right.
So, like that, but a lot more complicated is kind of how
Right.
our incarnations work out. It's like when the time you were born, your parents, I mean, think of all the variables that are set into place that you have no control of.
Right.
Some of them quite challenging, like in your own situation, you might have thought that you would have rather have chosen a culture that was more open to your sexuality. But in truth, we needed you to go through the exact experiences that you had.
At the place where it needed to happen,
Yep,
So,
exactly.
for instance, my path has affected many people just by seeing it. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've been with a cisgender person who has pulled me to the side and said, "Wow, you're the first trans person I've ever met." Like hundreds of people at this point. And some of those people have followed that up with, "And you're not like what I thought a trans person would be like," And so just by being myself, like I've actually changed people's perspectives, who may have at one point in their lives been a person who's spoken derogatory about people like me. And then having met somebody like me, for instance, I went to, full disclosure, I went to a rehab a couple of years back, and I was a trans person, and I could see the movement of people of when I first came in, and they had heard that a transgender person was coming to the unit because it was a co-ed dorm, so it was men and women, and they couldn't tell out of the 5 people who was the trans person that came over that day. They were confused. They were expecting like a guy with a 5 o'clock shadow and a wig and a dress, like that classic description of what people think a trans person is. So first of all, they couldn't tell. Second of all, once they like actually met me and saw like, wow, this is a educated person who is not bad in any means, fits in perfectly with us, and is not like a sexual deviant of some sort. Like it was mind blowing to them, that they could actually communicate with me and like, no, it's okay. Like I'm not gonna hurt you, and I'm not trying to intimidate you or coerce you in any type of way. Like I'm just trying to live my life the same way you're trying to live yours. It's kind of situation like that.
I think that a lot of time our individual works, we overlook the importance of them outside of outside of self. But because we're all interconnected, and on a certain level, everybody's doing the great work. It's just that different people are at it in different stages.
Sure.
So you realizing that truth and taking it back to the all, you see that there's the universal karma as well that's being changed soul by soul. So it's very Greek to say, well, you chose these conditions. You stood in front of the three fates, and the conditions of your life were cast into place, so that you could experience what you needed to fulfill your will, and for a greater purpose as well, because you fulfilling your personal work brings something, some knowledge to all of us and some light to all of us. And there's a deep karmic truth to that, at least that I've always accepted on a spiritual level, that I think most of humanity overlooks. We're not alone.
Yeah. It can, it's like life can be very lonely at times. I like in the Diary of the Drug Fiend, I'm gonna end up talking on section 2 about substances in a second. But like you made me think in the Diary of the Drug Fiend, it opens up with this person's inner dialogue, or the narrator's inner dialogue, about how lonely life is, and that people, or at least him, engages in sort of conversation as a means of distracting himself from the loneliness. No matter, even if you have a partner waiting at home, the narrator just felt so lonely. You could go home, lay down with your partner, but at the end of the day, he's putting his head on the pillow by himself and is not connected with anyone or anything. And for that person, it ended up being in the Diary of the Drug Fiend, that character goes through some serious drug-based trauma. In section 2, do you feel like man has the right to eat what he will, to drink what he will, to dwell where he will, to move on the face of the earth? I feel like that would be the section that implies man has the right to ingest any substance that they feel like. Because you're not necessarily eating, right? But it's like if a person smokes cannabis, for instance, you're not eating anything, but you're ingesting.
Yeah, and I think that you're absolutely correct. But just like I state there, though, I think what's important is for people to be honest with themselves and understand what they're intaking into their mind and into their body and into their heart. It has, multi-layered effects. And so while they have the right to ingest whatever they want, they might want to think about what adds up to good physical, spiritual, and mental health.
Right. What's going to cause problems in their life if they do it.
But that's the part of where that free will comes in, because we do get to choose, Right. But even if we choose to fall into a hole, we learn what that's all about, and hopefully we avoid the hole next time. Crowley in Magick and Theory and Practice, in a footnote, essentially applies that you can't really ever do anything that's not your true will. It's just
so everything is a growing developmental phase.
Yes.
No matter what.
Yeah. And the shame of life is that when you shut yourself off to that growth, when you want look at it, when you want reflect and stuff, where you want turn inward and listen to the voice of your angel ultimately.
Right.
But when a person sets about trying to better themselves and whatever mythos or words they want to use, when they truly do their best, I think it's just, life's just a growing experience, and there's ups and downs. It can be very hard and very lonely, and we all have felt that way at some point, That's but that's some of the beauty in life too. I mean, things wouldn't have the power if it wasn't for both sides of the equation,
Right. I mean, there's an aspect to that we need the challenges, and like in the Christian school, why does God allow sin? It's kind of similar to this concept. Is that part of the joy of the endless winging upon the swan through the universe going nowhere is just the journey itself, the conflicts, the triumphs, the sadness.
Yes, absolutely.
All of that is the joy, of the universe. The joy of existence is everything. Right?
There'd be no triumph in any game if you won every single time you played. You know what I mean?
Right. Then what's the point? But at the same time, we have this document that outlines these ways to live. So if everybody was living them, things would be in harmony. And let's say there was no conflict, we'd still have the joy of creation. We'd still have the joy of, there'd still be beauty everywhere, regardless. I think no
Yeah,
matter what, there would still be, and there would still be natural disasters. I don't think there's anything that we'd be able to do to stop that.
yeah,
Anytime soon, at
and
least, you know?
humanity will always come up with a new conflict. We're good at that.
Right.
So I think there's a lot we can do to improve things. I mean, how many masters and how many centuries, and we haven't even learned to just love and respect each other. So,
Right.
it's not like we don't got centuries of work in front of us. But, I think that on Malkuth, because everything below the abyss is divided, that by the time you're all the way down on Malkuth, you're going to have struggles and conflicts. That's just the nature of manifested existence. But that doesn't mean we can't do a lot better.
Mhm. I was actually doing some research this afternoon on one of the Sufi legends, or legendaries rather, Mansour al-Hallaj, if you're familiar with him,
Yes. Yes, of
on
course.
al-Alaq, right? I am truth,
Am
I am
I?
truth, I am truth, as he's
Yeah.
being killed, essentially, he's being stoned to death,
Yeah.
and he's laughing, he's in a hysterical laughter. And the joy of the world is just not having the fear of death, embracing all of the pain that comes with it and using it as a learning lesson and knowing that HGA and God is there with you at every single step of the way and just never losing contact with that. It kind of comes down with keeping the eye open. As long as that eye's open and you're doing everything you can to keep it open and you're following the path, even when you make mistakes, you fall back, scrape your knee, you get up and you keep going forward. There's an ecstasy in all of that,
Yeah. Without those challenges, there would be no growth. You'd live a very boring life.
Right.
You know.
But at the same time, so we have this document that we try to pass out and we try to give to people, not to impress it upon them as a mandatory thing that they have to embrace, but hey, we have this and we're offering it for free. All you have to do is accept it. And if you accept it and you feel like it's as beneficial for you as it is for us, you might feel inclined to also pass it off to other people. We're not there yet as far as society goes. Like there's still super oppression going on everywhere. And there's a lot
Yeah.
of work to be done on whether it's, you can't partake of substances of certain natures, they're illegal. You can't love who you will in certain parts of the world, they're illegal. You can't be born a certain way or else you're discriminated against. You can't live, I'm here in Jersey City, transition in New York City. It's like, for me, it's like every line in Liber OZ has subtitles underneath it and take responsibility for your actions, or in a sort of way, accept the outcome of your decision, of your actions, or of your thoughts, because there's going to be some type of outcome. A person, let's say they're born transgender in Arkansas, and they're trying to transition there in today's day and age as opposed to New York City. It's a much different place. What's going to come with that is going to be a lot different of an experience than what I had. It was a lot rougher in the 90s when I was a child, but when I was transitioning, times were changing, and I certainly had the inertia of the universe assisting me, which made it a little bit easier, but it was still a lot of fear, and there was still a lot of prejudice going on, even in this little progressive bubble that I'm living in, but I really caution people, whatever action you take, you have to take it if it's your will, but you have to also accept the outcomes and don't let that discourage you. There's a sort of joy, and it's in Liber Libre. It's like, if the earth was not harsh, how would you rid yourself of the how is it worded? Yes, the dross, right? The dross.
I can't remember that exact line either, but it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
It's kind of like, yeah, you need to have some type of hardship here. Otherwise, you're going to stay firmly attached karmically to reincarnation, and you're never going to get to that point of liberation of the flesh, if you will.
You sharpen your sword upon the stone, so to speak.
Exactly. So it's like all those little conflicts help you get to that point of detachment and allow you to live that spiritual, magical life. Otherwise, you would never get there. You know what I mean?
And of course, it's not for everybody. That's why do it that wilt and understanding that everybody's here on a different path. Those who are truly spiritually inclined and embrace any spiritual path are like 2% of any given spiritual group, really. You know, how many
Absolutely.
Christians are really doing what Christ taught?
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
and it's not much different than Thelema either. You know, so
Anyway,
yeah, the chosen and the preferred is there's a reason that the numbers are few. You know,
absolutely.
it's not everybody's work, but it is ours. If you're going to take up the sword, take up the great work, and call yourself a Thelemite, then do the work.
Right.
And yeah, so this is the work, and I think that that's our burden. We carry that on. That's our karma, and you invoke that into your life the moment you put into place any kind of action. So you go about calling yourself a Thelemite and you take up practice X, it's going to bring a karma path into your
Right.
life,
Well, Crowley writes about it in the Confessions. There's a quote that says, "The second a person takes their first initiation, they're whacking a beehive." you know, and if you're not ready to get stung, you have no business being there. You're better off just doing what you were doing, and Liber OZ is one of those texts you might still want to embrace because you don't necessarily have to pick up. You don't have to go for an initiation to practice Liber OZ. It's one of those texts that you could live a totally lay life, a layman life, or a lay
Yeah.
person life, and it'll improve the quality of life for sure if you're living its tenets. Section 5. I want to jump into Section 5. Man has the right to kill those who would thwart these rights. I think people have a lot of hangups with that because, as you quoted Crowley in your book, it's a safeguard against tyrannicide or safeguard tyrannicide. For instance, Hitler. I think like he's a great example of you have a person that's killing millions of people, starting a mass war, trying to globally dominate the world and enforce his law of how people should live and what is a good person, what is a bad person, just based on the nature of how they're born or what their culture is. And looking for some type of genetic predisposition, which he could not find in order to back his theory and his mad ideas. I think it's safe to say in an extreme case like that, yeah, Liber OZ gives you the right definitely as a group. I don't think that would be a one-person call, but that this person needs to be stopped. It's safe to say like this is something that should not be happening. This person does not have the right to just kill a bunch of people on a crazy idea.
Yeah,
But on
absolutely.
an individual scale, man has the right to kill those who would thwart these rights. And on one sense, it's like if a person's literally stopping you from doing your will, and like a person chooses to invoke Section 5, it still comes with that and take responsibility for your actions.
Yeah, you can never escape it, no matter what.
Right, because now you have a karmic link to that person of the most serious sort. But
Yeah, you
also,
might spend your life in prison for doing that, following through with
for
that action.
sure, for sure. Crowley writes in the magical record of the Great Beast 666, and it wasn't like a teaching, but it was definitely a thought that he felt, and he was doing a lot of drugs at the time, so we could give him some leeway that it might have just been a random thought and nothing more. But and I quote, he wrote us exactly that a person, no matter what nation they find themselves in, should do their best to live by the laws of that nation. And it's almost like the Rosicrucian idea of dressing to blend in with the culture. And I don't know that he actually taught that to students or really recommended it, but I remember reading it a few times and actually hunting down and finding where the quote was. So he's explicitly saying, don't break the laws wherever you are, follow the laws, don't get yourself in trouble. Yet he himself had a habit of breaking laws on several occasions. So it's kind of one of those things, I mean, doing drugs, mescaline, I don't believe is legal, or some of the other substances he was taking were illegally procured. Cocaine went illegal at a certain point, and he was still doing it, et cetera, et cetera. Any comments on Section 5? So I think people have a lot of hangups.
Sure. First of all, I think you basically summarized it well, that and there are points in life where you may have to kill another, physically kill another, and that be justified. You know what I mean? And some a person like Hitler could be a good example. If you're fighting to protect yourself, you're fighting in a war, something like that. But most wars really can't be justified. So that's the touchy thing to get into too. But one of the things that another thing of Metaphysics 101 is that great metaphysical truths are true from on the most mundane level and also on these much deeper levels. And that's the same thing with this line. So on the most mundane level, it is saying you have the right to kill those that truly interfere with your rights. But for the vast majority of us, the things that are preventing us from fulfilling our own true wills are our own bullshit. They're the internal shadows within that we have not faced. So those are the things that we should be focusing on. Remember, the line is you have the right to kill those things that thwart you from doing your true will. What are those things that are actually doing that? You need to find those things, those behaviors, those habits, those shadows, and kill them immediately. That's what Crowley's saying there.
I totally agree with you, and you made me think. I think it's a symptom in our society today that people constantly are aggressive towards other people because of their own insecurities. And I think I opened up by saying it when I was reading the intro that people are afraid of being themselves for being judged by their peers. So they take their anger out on other people, whether they're depressed or angry or whatever, and they project it onto other people and they start pointing the finger. Look at what this person's doing over here. Everybody look at them and taunt them and shame them and attack them. And really, it's because they don't want anybody looking at themselves. Really, they don't want to be looking at themselves. So they're doing everything to get the attention off of themselves.
Yeah. So Crowley writes like that all the time, and this line is one of those where there's this mundane aspect of it, but there's also something much deeper, and it's true on both planes. But when a person reads Oz or any holy book, really, what they take out of it has usually, much more a reflection of who they truly are than whatever the master who wrote those things meant. Crowley said Magick's a mirror. I think all holy books, all religious practices, they're all mirrors. I read the Bible. I don't find any reason to hate gay people. Other Christians might read the Bible and find nothing but reasons to hate gay people. It's not because the Bible's telling us to hate gay people. It's because it's what's within the eye of the readers. We're projecting our own thoughts outward, and people do this with spiritual teachings all the time. So a lot of people will look at the laws, the strong, and they see this, the way they interpret the third chapter. I mean, how many times you hear Thelemites and all the views on it are all this kind of stamp down the weak kind of mentality. And I think that's a reflection of where those people really stand, because there's most certainly a way to interpret all those passages. People will read Oz and they'll come to all kinds of conclusions. And that line's one of the hot ones, but listen to who's saying that and why they're drawing that conclusion,
Right. On Liber OZ, right, something I never even noticed was and I have it, it's on page 88 in your book, and it's about the mark of the beast. And you pointed out that 666 is written on the Saturn point, which is pointing downward in this case. And it relates to the biblical quote, like, he who hath understanding, etc., and the number is 666. That's a very famous passage from Revelation. Do you think that him putting 666 on Saturn is intentional in any way, or was it just coincidence? Or I never even noticed that it was on Saturn. Like it never struck me as something to analyze, but it's like super interesting.
I don't think it's accidental or coincidence, because he drew it out. He put some time and some effort into the sketches. I included that line because, of course, it's my own metaphysical analysis, and I always found it very interesting that 666 is described as the number of man, and in the book Revelation. So to see 666 as a perfected man is a very kind of Gnostic Luciferian way of looking at that formula. And so that's why I use it in that context, essentially.
Okay, so being that like Bina literally translates as understanding, a person who has understanding is going to be able to apply Liber OZ in different capacity to a person who does not have understanding.
Well, a person
Kind
that
of
has become
connection
the Christos, the
Sure.
perfected self, should certainly be able to apply Oz in their life
Right. Right.
in a proper manner. And 666 is just the Thelemic version of that Christos formula.
Okay.
It's the perfected Tippereth. It's a solar formula. I found that, in fact, I think I'm the only one that's found that 666 formula on the Tree of Life. But if you take the paths associated to the planets within the Ruach, and they add up to 666, and I mentioned that in the book too. I've always found that to be a very nice Kabbalistic connection, that
Okay.
the paths that when we do the Golden Dawn sort of approach to the Tree of Life, the spheres of the Ruach is where all the work really is. That's where we're trying to perfect the self.
Gotcha.
And all those spheres they're centered around the sun. And the sun is 666. The square of the sun is 666. The paths that all these paths represent add up to 666. So it's like the perfected solar self is represented in that formula, Kabbalistically.
And so it's interesting because the next thing I have written down on the paper is that Oz represents, quote, the influence of Kether. And so it's kind of like you're already elaborating on that. And
Yes.
I think it's super interesting. It's kind of like dissecting this text, taking the time to sit down, really understand this text, and to apply it is to draw down that light into this formula of the Christos through the root will, and to project that will into the manifestation.
Because otherwise you're bound to not be doing what's truly in line with your true will and everything. Manifesting your word is the same. Is another way of saying doing your true will.
God, can you say that again?
Manifesting your word,
is doing the will, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But that's manifesting it perfect. What happens is that there's this concept that comes out of the abyss, but by the time it manifests down on Malkuth and has gone through the lens of the Ruach and everything, it's all polluted. So. Using metaphors, the idea is that you're clearing the astral waters, so to speak, so that the word can descend into matter pure and unmolested, free of all the attachments and shadows, the demons and whatnot that are in your Ruach, instead you get 10 equals 1 and 1 equals 10, and then man is God, you see, because Kether and Malkuth are one, essentially. But because the process of creation is ongoing, that you always get something, you know what I mean? So that's why Crowley says you're always doing magic, so you might as well learn to do it right. What we think we're going to become is the same thing as you're manifesting your word. It's just that you're doing your true will to a certain level. It's just that it's all fucked up because you haven't learned how to deal with whatever shadows or experiences or karmic things you have to work out.
So I've got like 2 more questions.
Sure.
One is like sort of simple, and then the last one's kind of like a closing sort of discussion. I'm gonna post a picture of the placements of the section of Oz onto the Sephiroth that you have, and I thought it was interesting that you put section 5 on Tiferet, not Malkuth. I was curious as to the rationale behind that.
Once again, it came down to that me over and over and over again trying all these different permeations of what Crowley meant, and then settling on the one that worked the best. And what I realized was that as soon as something enters the subconscious mind, it's going to manifest on the outer in one form or another. It is what we think we become, but it's not so black and white. I can't think I'm a great guitarist can wake up tomorrow and be a great guitarist. It doesn't work that easily. You know what I mean? So in a nutshell, Tippereth, which represents consciousness, must be guarded from or protected from all thoughts and influences which are not in alignment with one's true will.
So when you say that, it's almost like the concept of the magical weapon of the scourge, correct?
It's exactly like that. By the time something enters consciousness, it's definitely going to manifest on the outer. So if you want to look at those things, kill those things that thwart you from doing your true will, then at this point they have to have been put under thumb, or it's too late. But whatever we allow to enter our subconscious mind will manifest on the outer in one form or another. So the idea is that Tippereth is kind of that point where you have to keep clear and pure of all of these other outer influences, or else what manifests down below is going to be influenced in one form or another by whatever it is, those shadows and whatnot. So if you look at like the idea behind Mars and the scourge and the chain, and if you look at what Crowley talks about as those martial influences, which I really thought that line about tyranny, not allowing it to enter the mind at all, it's something you have to be on guard with. You know, it takes discipline, it takes the chain, it takes the scourge. To go read in book 4 what Crowley writes about the scourge, and you'll get what I'm saying there. That there's a footnote on it in 777 too. It's quite fascinating, but it's essentially saying that at this point at Tippereth, you have to kill everything that's coming in immediately, or else it's going to manifest on the lower. You thought that's about to enter the subconscious mind is a friend, not an enemy. They have to prove that they're worthy to enter into the holies of holies before you allow them in. That's the scourge at the threshold. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Before it enters the mind, you got to stop it right there.
Yeah.
So that's it. I don't know if I'm describing that well enough, but that's why
I got it.
5 fit right at Tippereth.
I got it. And then one of the last things, like I love the unpublished letters that you put into the work, because like, for instance, I think you're affiliated with the Astron Argon AA page.
Yes, yes.
Online. So I actually did like a Google search, and I was able to get a PDF copy of his unpublished commentary on the Golden Verses, which I've never even heard of before.
Yeah, they're pretty good. They're pretty good.
So like that's next on my reading list now. So I was super excited to get
word
that.
in
But
to
also,
HB some time ago that I'd really love to write a commentary on those and publish them.
It would be great to do, because there's a lot of unpublished stuff by Crowley, and so to get to see some of these letters that are in the archives, that are in your book is just amazing. You know, just to, even if you're not interested
in the book.
Yeah, like even if you're not interested in Liber OZ, which as a Thelemite, I don't know how you cannot be, just to get your book in order to see all of the unpublished work that you put into it, his letters, his thoughts, his commentaries on things that have not been published. That alone is like super awesome. So in one of these letters,
by the graces of HB and Heydrich, I have access, more access than most of the archives, and you know, I'm just like everybody else. When I was going through and seeing all this stuff, I was like, this stuff's cool, you know what I mean? So I just wanted to include it in the book for that very reason. I know there's other nerds out there like myself that would love to see this material that normally just sits in a folder someplace, you know?
So I actually lied. I'm going to come back to that in a second. I had 2 last questions. I had misread my notes. So I'm going to come back to the unpublished letters in a second, because I have like a nice little closing idea with one of them. But I'm going to quote you over here. This is Crowley to W.B. Crow, and it says, "The right to medical assistance is already implied." And so I put the note here: do you suppose that falls into the category of man has the right to die as he will, or rather not die, if the condition be curable? And I just wrote as a small little commentary to that, because today we see people calling themselves Thelemites and fighting against universal healthcare, especially in the US. And it's funny, in the United States, doctors the world over swear the Hippocratic Oath. Yeah, you could die or be in lifelong debt in this country, even losing your house because you can't afford a treatment and you have to take mortgages out that you can never pay off. So it's almost as if they've confused, or I think that they've confused the Hippocratic Oath with the hypocritical oath in a sort of way. I just wanted to put that little jab in there, you know. But how do you feel about his implication that Liber OZ incorporate healthcare as a right,
I
or the
think
right not to die?
That humanity on a universal level has paid dearly in blood and tears for every inch of progress that we have made. And we are at a place in society has evolved to a place where there should be no more hunger and everybody should have health care, and it's completely achievable and nobody would have to lose. It's not going to, you know, it's not going to crash the economy. It's none of this kinds of crazy ideas. We have the ability to meet the basic needs of every human being on the planet. And I think it's a shame that we haven't risen to the level where we see the import in that and do that. I mean, name one spiritual teacher that hasn't suggested that we do. You know, and I agree with Crowley. It does imply that, right? And you know, there's a strong level of conservatism in Thelema, and I get what they're saying, and I get where they're coming from. But at the end of the day, Crowley was exceedingly liberal for his day, you know, and conservatism is Thelema has to constantly evolve, or else we'll fall down the same paths that all the other world religions have. You know,
because in this country, conservatism, and this is my thing with it, is that there's never a shortage of money when it comes to war and killing people. But when it comes to helping people, either giving them medical assistance or giving them an education, nope, we have no money. But suddenly you need $1 trillion or several $100 billion to create bombs that we're never going to use, hopefully that we're never going to use, that we shouldn't have even a quarter of how many bombs. We wouldn't need that many to blow up, you know, all of the landmass on the earth. There's an endless supply of money to throw into that bottomless pit, but we don't have the money for medical or education. So it's complete hypocrisy, in my view.
Of course, because if we absolutely do have the money. We absolutely do. We have the technology and we have the money to solve. Nobody should have to suffer without food, homelessness, or medical care.
We throw out more food in this country than the whole world could eat in a day.
We do have the power to solve those problems. It just has not been a priority for the powers to be. And you know, a great deal of the division in the politics is because there's people pulling the strings, don't want these things solved. You know what I mean? We're not at that point yet. That's why you can tell we're still in the old Aeon. There's still these things that are keeping us divided when they shouldn't. But humanity's lost. Humanity's, you know, most people are lost, and this is a plane of this kind of work. So we can't be surprised, and I'm never surprised at Thelemites who have such strong opinions about these things, because since we invoke the new Aeon, of course, we're at the forefront of that battle, philosophically speaking. If we can't, within our own numbers, solve our political differences, how can we expect it elsewhere? You see what I'm saying?
Right.
We've invoked, we're battling against old Aeonic thought and theory within ourselves every single day. If you're a Thelemite, you know what I mean? So of course it's in our community, and the struggles that you see spiritually going on are reflected in the Malkuthian plane. So humanity's everywhere divided. I still have
a will divided against itself is not going to work. You know?
No. Yeah, I at the end, I have a great faith in humanity. I just think that sadly, we've never been willing to change without great loss, usually
Right.
of life.
Right. It always comes down to there has to be some big tragedy in order for change to occur.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the sad part.
Yeah.
Unfortunate. It's avoidable. It's avoidable in so many fronts, and
It,
that's what we're fighting against. You know, we're fighting against as Thelemites. We're fighting not only against these externals, but we're fighting against the internals, like you mentioned. And it's a matter of changing and having our
there's that line where
having
Crowley
our
says that.
morals,
Yeah, there's that
having our
line where
morals
Crowley.
challenged. Hmm.
There's a line where Crowley says that you've arrived at a very decisive moment in history. We're in a day-to-day battle against tyranny and oppression,
Right. Right.
and
This
ours is our sword. You know.
it is, and it's just a matter of getting it out to people, and hopefully, you know, the right people get their hands on it at the right times, and everybody could one day maybe accept this thing. And I would like to see a Thelemic world that ran where everybody did their will.
Yeah.
Because look, even in Crowley's day at Cefalu, you know, there was problems that arose there from people not doing their will, but they were trying. You
Of
know,
course.
you make mistakes as you go along. Sometimes you're kind of fishing in the dark in the beginning
Of
stages
course.
of
Yes.
your own great work, and you're learning. You know, it's trial by error, and so you learn from your mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are costly. You know, like somebody drank water. Crowley said, "Don't drink from that lake. Do not drink from that. It will hurt you," and ended up killing the person. You know, and getting him kicked out of Cefalu consequently.
We can't get discouraged though. We can't get discouraged in that. You
Right,
know, the
right,
thing is that I truly have faith in humanity in the long run. I don't think there's any shortcuts. So we can't get to that place until everybody's learned the lessons they need to learn to be there.
right,
Like gnosis itself is direct knowledge that you've gained through experience of seeing God in front of you. And when you have
hmm,
those kinds of experiences, then you know it's direct knowledge. In a sense, I think karma works on that same level, that we can't effectuate these greater changes we want to see in the world just by reading alone. You know, Oz will impact me and you because we're Thelemites, but your average person won't get anything from it. They have to go through whatever experiences they need in the real world
right,
to you know to come to those conclusions on their own. And
right.
this is the plane where we work things out. So I very much believe that we are essentially given as many incarnations as we need, and that's why there's you know we can't become discouraged in the work, or we lose faith, so to speak. We just got to keep plugging away, and everybody's on a different path, and humanity's got a long way to go before we reach that new Aeonic idealistic society we all wish we were part of on some level. But
Now,
the new Aeon's not even here for another 150 some odd years. So come
right,
back in 400 or 500 years, it'll be much
right,
better. There'll be
right.
other
That's the
problems,
thing.
but probably not these. You know.
Hopefully, as long as we survive, you know, if climate change is going to do what they're saying it's going to do, hopefully we avoid these disasters, or hopefully if they do happen, enough of us, you know, get through them. And I too have faith in humanity, so I like the positivity. Um, I'm
We're
glad that you
very
brought the
resilient.
positivity,
We're
because a
very
lot of this
resilient.
stuff could be super dark. A lot of this stuff could be super dark, depressing. And it's very easy to fall into that, but it's hard to be the hermit. You got to keep the light shining in the darkness. You know, you just got to keep that lamp lit.
Yeah, what I've noticed is that humanity's resilience is such that in the darkest and hardest times, the most beautiful souls come into existence
Yes.
and guide us forward. And
Right.
that's been true throughout history. The
Right.
greatest artists, the greatest musicians, the real changers, they you know, the universal will, karma, whatever, will manifest them when it's necessary. And
Yeah.
we move forward.
I think Crowley says something along that line, like, at the darkest time, the world will be full of prophets. You know, something
Yeah.
similar to that effect, where it's like, when the world needs it, people, the spirits are there to incarnate. You know, um, this
It's
goes
like
into. Go ahead.
would we have jazz of not for poverty. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
The horror of poverty that was
Right.
inflicted
Blues.
on Black people in the South specifically.
Yeah.
But look what they did with it. They created
Right.
a beautiful art, and that essentially is what you see happen over and over and over
Right.
and over.
That's a super magical process. The way you broke, the way you brought that up. It's a super magical thing, turning pain into beauty.
Yeah.
So this comes from
and we do it.
This comes from one of the unpublished letters, and it was like towards the end of the book. And Crowley wrote to York, you don't really believe in magic. And he goes on to say that the key to that is for York to be interpret every phenomena as a particular dealing of God with your soul, and to look at and the idea of that is to look at the universe as this giant organism manifested from the Ein Sof, or. So all of existence has come from nothingness. Everything essentially is God. So if everything's God, and we're starting to see it in quantum physics today that
Yes.
It almost appears as if atomic particles have consciousness or an awareness to being perceived. And when they're perceived, there's something that happens and they act differently. So if they could act differently based on being perceived, there's some type of consciousness directing that. So we're starting to see, even in science, physical science, that there's a underlying consciousness and law that governs everything. So even the scientists are starting to see that. So the idea that you sit down and interpret everything happening as a particular dealing of God with your soul, on one side it could become like an OCD schizophrenic type of fear of demons chasing you type of goetic experience, if you've seen people have those. But on the other side, it can be very beautiful that everything is communicating to me in a very positive, uplifting outlet. But there's times where you go through a dark night of the soul and you go through these EIO phases and the apophis phase where things get dark, and sometimes they can last pretty long.
Yes, that's true.
So I like that you brought up so much positivity, because I wonder, so for people that hit those dry points, like for myself, God, I hit like a year and a half right before COVID had started, where I was just dry. I had gone through some trying magical experiences. I had some head busters, and I was just dry, and I was still doing the work and everything. But for people that get to those dark nights of the soul, do you have any words, to kind of close with for the dark moments, or when you don't feel maybe if magic's for you, or if you need a break, or whatever the situation is, when people are going through those type of experiences, anything to uplift them or to explain on anything that I kind of threw out there?
Sure. What specifically might help somebody when they're suffering through things in life is very individualistic and very personal, and it could vary from A to Z. But one thing I will say that I think is consistent, especially for those that are on the path, is that exactly what the line says there. Every single aspect of your incarnation is divine, and it's a part of your great myth, your great story. And you wouldn't be who you are without every inch of it, so to speak. So the moment you see every aspect of your life through that lens, your suffering changes. It just changes. And to me, that idea of spilling every drop of blood into the cup, that's what it means. Is that quite literally everything you see is towards that one end. So what I tell to students and friends is I tell them to willify their life. Like we do will, and we say we eat and drink to this end that we fulfill our great work. But in truth, you went to work so that you could earn money, so that you could put gas in your car, so that you could drive to the supermarket and buy the food to put into your body. So once you realize every single action you take, it's all interconnected. Everything you do is towards that one end. Mm-hmm. And so it's a matter of perspective, and it's not an easy one to get. I mean, that's why it's you're looking at the Oath of the Abyss on that. That's the last line. But if you look at the Oath of the Abyss, there's one for each Sephiroth, and they essentially give you the mindset of what you got to get over in that particular sphere or stage to move on to the next one. So you can put yourself in this mindset where you see how everything's connected. And then you can easily, there's all kinds of practices that you can adopt that help you practice mindfulness in a sense. You remain mindful constantly of the great work. A Buddhist method is that one of the Buddhist practices is that everybody you see as the Buddha. Everybody that you meet, you see as the Buddha. And there's variations of this depending on whatever particular system that you're working. But at the end of the day, if you can flip your mind into to truly accepting or believing in your heart, when something's heartfelt, when you believe it to your core, you can't lie to yourself. You know what I mean? So you either believe it to your core or you don't. But if you get to that place where you see everything every single aspect of your incarnation as something directly related between you and the gods, then that suffering is essentially alleviated, because you recognize that it's a temporary illusion, a condition upon which you're being refined, etc. There's a purpose to it. There's a purpose to everything. Now, I don't know if that's really going to help anybody, though, because typically when we're in those situations, we have to just labor through them, and I think we have to learn how to suffer. We have to know how to suffer. We have to learn how to get over suffering too, because that's a part of life.
It's like the saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering becomes an option.
Yeah, and people don't know how to let things go and let them, it's like they're carrying around all this guilt and all this baggage, but for who and for what reason?
On that note, it's kind of like there was something in the Gnostic Mass that I had noticed one time, and it's when the priest gives the sign of benediction, and benediction is sort of healing, but it's also forgiveness. So it's kind of like a cleansing of sins. But in a Thelema contest, it's just like a reminder that you could start over any minute for me. I kind of noticed that during a mass, like I was going through a little something in life, one of those little hiccups that happened. And I remember just thinking about that as this priest gave the sign of benediction, and then he blessed us at the end of the mass. And it was just like a cleansing of the sort, not of sin or anything like that, but of, I get to push the reset button right now, and I get to continue forward.
That's kind of the beauty even behind the teachings of the Christos, when that Christian idea that even at the moment of death you can be forgiven of all sins. I believe that's essentially true. If once again, being true to yourself and your heart, you've moved past those shadows. It's not, karma's not like this thing that you have to pay back eye for an eye and stuff. You know what I mean?
Right. No, it's not an exact debt list. It's just cause and effect.
Yeah, so it's about coming to a realization, and you've kind of have moved past that, So one of the teachings is that I forgive all trespassers as I trespassed against them. Right. That's a very powerful thing if you can truly forgive, not just the mistakes of others, but your own mistakes.
Right.
Because if you carry that shit around, it creates shadows.
Yeah.
It creates demons. We have to learn to let go. And grieving is a part of that, knowing how to grieve properly.
So again, Robert, thank you for doing this. The book is titled On the Rights of Men. There's still a few paperbacks available. Hopefully we'll see a second edition in the future. Check out LibreOzProject.com. You're an absolute inspiration to me and a lot of other people. So just having the pleasure to sit down and talk to you for a couple hours, let alone about something that you created, you produced, and that is just like, it's super praiseworthy. I can't say anything more than that. Like it's such a good book. If you have not read it, get your hands on one before it's out. Man, I hope that you do more work in the future. I'd like to see other stuff from you. It was awesome reading it, and it's awesome talking to you, man.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
No problem. So love is the law, love under will, and we'll catch you guys another time. Later.